Near the end of the 13th century BCE, multiple flourishing civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean abruptly fell into ruin. As one archaeologist described it, it was a cataclysm of immense proportions. Great Bronze Age kingdoms in Greece, Anatolia, and the Near East suddenly collapsed. Within a span of only a few decades, circa 1200 to 1150 BC, city after city was destroyed or abandoned. Almost every major urban center, from Pylos in Greece to Gaza in Canaan, met a violent end. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece were burned, the Hittite imperial capital was leveled, and coastal trading cities like Ugarit were reduced to ash. Trade routes that had linked these kingdoms were cut, large populations migrated or vanished, and literacy plummeted. The aftermath was a centuries-long dark age during which skills like writing were lost or diminished, and populations shrank. The dramatic Bronze Age collapse remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. How could so many advanced societies crumble almost simultaneously? Understanding this collapse first requires appreciating what came before. The Late Bronze Age, circa 1500 to 1200 BC, was a time of sophisticated states and international connectivity. Powerful kingdoms such as the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptian New Kingdom along the Nile, and various palace-based states in the Levant and Mesopotamia formed an interlinked world. They built monumental palaces and temples, mastered bronze metallurgy, and maintained libraries of cuneiform or linear B texts. An extensive trade network bound them together: copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, gold from Egypt, grain from Canaan, and pottery and textiles circulated widely. Diplomacy and international treaties, e.g. correspondences like the Amarna letters, fostered political alliances. This prosperous world, however, was also highly interconnected and specialized. Wealth and power were concentrated in palaces, and each region depended on others for vital resources. Such interdependence meant that a disturbance in one part could cascade through the system. In hindsight, the very complexity and centralization that made the Late Bronze Age impressive may have also made it fragile. Around 1200 BC, a perfect storm of calamities struck, and this interconnected system collapsed, ushering in a new era. In the sections below, we examine which civilizations were affected and explore the leading theories, from scholarly to speculative, about what caused this profound collapse. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single kingdom's fall, but a regional domino effect. Here are the major civilizations that were impacted. The Mycenaeans, the Bronze Age Greek civilization renowned for its palace strongholds and the legendary heroes of Homer, were utterly devastated. Around 1200 BC, nearly all the fortified palace centers in southern Greece were destroyed by fire or abandoned in short order. These included Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and others that had dominated the Greek mainland. At Pylos, the palace of Nestor, archaeologists found clay tablets charred in the final conflagration that record emergency measures, including the stationing of watchers guarding the coast, suggesting the kingdom was bracing for an imminent seaborne attack. Whatever the threat, it arrived. Pylos and its writing archives were burnt and never rebuilt. With the collapse of the palaces went the linear B writing system, used for administrative records. Literacy in Greece nearly vanished for centuries after. Craft production and art declined, long-distance trade halted, and population fell. Greece entered a dark age in which even the memory of the Grand Mycenaeans survived only in oral legends. It would be some 400 years before Greek civilization re-emerged, the era of the classical polis, inheriting a land dotted with the ruins and tombs of a forgotten, glorious past. At the same time, the Hittite Empire, a great power centered in Anatolia, modern Turkey, met a sudden end. The Hittites had ruled much of Anatolia and northern Syria, rivaling Egypt for dominance. But around 1180 BC, their empire disintegrated. The royal capital, Hattusa, was violently destroyed and never to be occupied again in its former glory. Archaeological layers at Hattusa show a city reduced to charred rubble. With the capital and central administration gone, the Hittite imperial system collapsed. In the following years, writing in Hittite cuneiform ceased, and vassal kingdoms broke away or fell to other invaders. Records from the Hittite realm's final decades hint at desperation. Letters from the last Hittite kings, like Suppiluliuma II, mention famine and pleas for grain shipments from Egypt, as well as enemy attacks on Hittite vassals. Whether due to starvation, invasions, or internal revolt, likely a combination, the Hittite state could not survive. By 1150 BC, there was no Hittite king, only scattered successor entities like Neo-Hittite small kingdoms in the region. Anatolia entered a dark age of its own, and new ethnic groups, the Phrygians and others, moved into parts of the Hittite territory in the ensuing centuries. Egypt, unlike the Mycenaeans or Hittites, did not entirely collapse at 1200 BC, but it was profoundly shaken and diminished. The new kingdom of Egypt, the era of famous pharaohs like Ramesses II, had extended Egyptian power into Canaan and Syria. However, during the late 13th to 12th century BC, Egypt faced invasions and internal strife that marked the beginning of its decline. Pharaoh Merneptah, around 1207 BC, recorded attacks by Libyans, aided by groups of mysterious sea raiders. A generation later, during the reign of Ramesses III, circa 1180s BC, Egypt fought a massive invasion by the Sea Peoples, a confederation of foreign groups. Names in Egyptian records include the Peliset, Cheker, Shardana, Denyen, and others, who attacked Egypt by land and sea. Ramesses III won a celebrated victory over these Sea Peoples, as depicted in his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, declaring, "No land can stand fast before my arms." He indeed managed to repel the invaders and claimed to have secured Egypt. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it paid a steep price for these victories. The heavy cost of constant wars against Sea Peoples, Libyans, and others depleted Egypt's economy and weakened its government. After Ramesses III, the centralized power of pharaohs waned. Egypt lost its remaining territories in the Levant. Many Egyptian garrisons and colonial outposts in Canaan were abandoned or destroyed around this time. By the end of the 12th century BC, Egypt had retreated to its Nile heartland and plunged into turmoil, the later Third Intermediate Period. Thus, while Egyptian civilization endured, it receded in power and splintered, never regaining the international dominance it once had. Elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, numerous smaller kingdoms and cities were wiped out. Along the Levantine coast, Canaanite city-states that had thrived on trade were destroyed in succession. For example, the port of Ugarit in present-day Syria. Excavations at Ugarit reveal that the city was violently burned around 1190 BC and never reoccupied. In Ugarit's final days, its king Amurapi sent a desperate letter to a neighboring ruler, pleading for help as an enemy approached. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us," wrote Amurapi, noting that his own armies were away and his land was defenseless. This vivid eyewitness account confirms that Ugarit was overwhelmed by a sudden attack from the sea, likely by the Sea Peoples or related raiders, leaving the city in flames. Many other urban centers throughout Syria and the Levant met a similar fate during this period of chaos. It is important to note that not every state vanished in the Great Collapse. A few powers weathered the storm, albeit in altered form. Notably, Assyria in Mesopotamia survived, suffering only a temporary slump before reasserting itself in the Iron Age. In the eastern highlands, the kingdom of Elam, in what is now Iran, also persisted. On the Levantan coast, some Phoenician cities like Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon seem to have escaped total destruction. These cities even flourished in the subsequent Iron Age as centers of trade and culture. But these were exceptions. The overall picture by 1150 BC was a patchwork of collapse. The once great international order was gone. The Bronze Age world of big kingdoms gave way to a fragmented Iron Age landscape of small villages, pastoral nomads, and isolated city-states struggling to rebuild amid the ruins. The Bronze Age collapse truly marks the end of an era. What could have caused such a widespread breakdown? Scholars have long pondered this question and proposed a range of explanations, as we explore next. Modern historians and archaeologists generally believe no single cause can fully explain the Bronze Age collapse. Instead, multiple stresses hit these societies in a short period, creating a cascading systems collapse. Below, we summarize the main theories, which are not mutually exclusive and likely all played a role. Waves of invasions by outside groups have long been blamed for the collapse. Foremost among these are the mysterious Sea Peoples, thought to be seaborne raiders or migrants who attacked Egypt and other regions around 1200 BC. Egyptian records explicitly describe battles with these Sea Peoples, and archaeological evidence, like destruction layers in coastal cities and the Ugarit letter above, indicates raiders arriving by ship. The Sea Peoples are believed to have included groups that later settled in new lands. For example, the Philistines in southern Canaan were likely one such group. Strikingly, genetic evidence now supports this. DNA from Philistine burials in Ashkelon shows an infusion of European ancestry around the 12th century BC, suggesting a migration of people from the Aegean or Western Mediterranean into Canaan. These migrants may have been among the Sea Peoples that clashed with Egypt and roamed the coasts. In Greece, too, later Greek tradition spoke of northern newcomers, often called Dorians, moving into Mycenaean lands after the palaces fell. Invasions could thus explain many burn layers and the sudden appearance of new pottery styles and weapons in various regions. However, while there is clear evidence of attacks, historians now doubt that invasions alone caused the entire collapse. More recent scholarship views the Sea Peoples as possibly the result of the upheaval, displaced populations on the move, as much as a cause. In other words, marauders took advantage of weakening states, but those states may already have been destabilized by other forces. In any case, warfare and mass migration were certainly part of the collapse story, turning thriving regions into battlefields and refugee flows. Growing scientific evidence suggests that environmental stress, especially a prolonged drought, was a critical factor in the Bronze Age collapse. Pollen analysis and sediment cores from around the Near East show significant climate shifts at the end of the Bronze Age. For example, a study of pollen from the Sea of Galilee and Dead Sea indicates a sharp decrease in water-intensive trees and a rise in dry climate vegetation, like olive trees, between roughly 1250 and 1100 BC. This signals a period of significantly lower rainfall. The researchers describe this late 13th–12th century drought as the most severe climate event in the region for many centuries. Likewise, tree ring data from Anatolia show a multi-year dry period around 1198 to 1196 BC, and Dead Sea lake levels dropped dramatically, over 50 meters lower by the end of the 12th century, clear evidence of a regional precipitation collapse. Such megadroughts would have devastated agriculture, causing crop failures and famine. In agrarian societies where the palace economy stored grain to feed the populace, a collapse in harvests could quickly lead to starvation, internal unrest, and mass migration in search of food. Indeed, texts from this era, for example letters from the Hittites, plead for grain shipments, implying widespread famine. Scholars think an extended drought could have triggered conflicts as starving populations and displaced groups moved into new areas, potentially explaining the sudden movements of the sea peoples. Climate change alone might not destroy a society, but as one study noted, it created a continual stress over several generations that undermined the resilience of these kingdoms. In the Late Bronze Age case, an extended dry period likely led to economic breakdowns, weakened governments, and made the entire region vulnerable to other shocks. While climate was not necessarily the sole culprit, it set the stage for collapse. The consensus now is that a series of drought-induced famines was a major piece of the puzzle, consistent with the archaeological and paleoclimate data. Some researchers have proposed that a sequence of large earthquakes struck the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, contributing to the destruction of many sites. This earthquake storm hypothesis suggests that the region's major seismic fault lines in Greece, Turkey, and the Levant might have ruptured in a domino effect over several decades, leveling cities in a chain reaction. It is true that a few ruined towns show signs that could be interpreted as earthquake damage. Walls collapsed outward, human remains crushed under debris without evidence of invasion. For instance, parts of Mycenae's citadel and sites in Anatolia have been cited as possible quake victims. However, recent studies have cast doubt on how widespread or decisive earthquakes were. Many destruction layers once attributed to quakes are now known to be caused by human attack or fire, or they occurred at dates not tightly clustered around 1200 BC. While earthquakes likely did occur in this period, the Aegean is a quake-prone zone, they are not seen as a primary driver of the systemic collapse. At most, a natural disaster could have exacerbated troubles. For example, an earthquake destroying a key city could weaken a kingdom already suffering from famine or war. Scholars note that earthquakes alone tend to produce localized damage, but societal collapse requires additional factors, political, economic, etc. Indeed, recent research concludes that earthquakes were not as influential as previously believed in the Bronze Age collapse. A related natural cause sometimes discussed is volcanic activity. For example, an eruption of the Hekla volcano in Iceland around 1159 BC has been suggested to cause climatic cooling and harvest failures during Ramesses III's reign. Yet the dating and impact of Hekla's eruption remain uncertain, and it occurred slightly later than many collapses. In summary, natural disasters likely played a secondary role. They could knock down a few pillars of Bronze Age society, but they were not solely responsible for bringing down the entire edifice. Another angle is that these kingdoms fell from within due to their own complexity and social tensions, essentially a systemic failure of society. The late Bronze Age states were hierarchical, centralized, and often stretched thin. The archaeologist Joseph Tainter's general systems collapse theory argues that highly complex societies can become too costly to sustain, making them vulnerable to breakdown when stressed. In the late Bronze Age context, the palace economies and bureaucracies may have grown inefficient or fragile. There is evidence for internal strife. For example, some texts hint at rebellions or civil wars, peasants revolting against elites, or mercenaries turning against their employers. The critical flaws of that world, its top-heavy governance, concentration of wealth among elites, and dependence on long-distance trade, meant that if any part faltered, say food supply or trade revenue, the whole system could unravel. Scholars have suggested that as pressures mounted, famine, invasions, refugee movements, the ruling classes could not manage the crises. Common people may have lost faith in the ruling elites or even taken up arms against them.
In some Mycenaean sites, the final destruction layers contain human remains and signs of violent internal conflict.
A cycle of palace burnings and social chaos might reflect not just foreign attacks, but also uprisings or feuds among local factions when central authority collapsed. In essence, a general societal breakdown occurred. Administration stopped functioning, cities could not be maintained, and people abandoned the old ways of life to revert to smaller, simpler community structures. This idea of systems collapse dovetails with the other factors. Drought, war, and trade collapse all would stress the system, and once a tipping point was reached, the complex societies could not recover. The interconnected nature of the Late Bronze Age meant that collapse was contagious. If one key node, say the Hittite grain supply or the copper trade, failed, it transmitted crises to other parts of the network, accelerating the overall downfall. In summary, internal weaknesses and the cumulative stress of multiple failures led to a cascading systemic collapse, wherein people effectively gave up on the old order and sought simpler survival strategies. Some historians have pointed to changes in military technology and tactics around this time that may have undermined the old powers. Late Bronze Age armies were built around chariots and bronze weapons, which were expensive and reliant on metal imports. There is evidence that around 1200 BC, ironworking began to spread, and new types of weapons, iron swords, javelins, and longbows, appeared. Iron, once techniques were mastered, could be locally produced in many areas, unlike bronze, which required a trade in tin. It's possible that groups equipped with iron weapons or more flexible fighting styles had an edge over traditional chariot armies. The collapse of bronze trade itself might have forced this shift. As supplies of tin were cut off, societies had to innovate with iron. Robert Drews, a historian, argued that the rise of massed infantry armed with stabbing swords and spears made the old chariot-based warfare obsolete, allowing raiders or upstart groups to overwhelm the proud chariot corps of states. This theory is debated, but it likely captures part of the picture. Military innovation was happening at this time. For instance, skeletons and weapons found at destruction sites suggest close-quarters combat and sieges that chariots could not handle well. Also, fortifications were changed or improved in the early Iron Age, implying responses to new threats. In short, shifts in warfare, whether as cause or effect, accompanied the collapse. The spread of iron metallurgy and new tactics is frequently listed among the factors in this period of upheaval. Even if these shifts didn't cause the initial collapse, they ensured that when the rebuilding began, the Iron Age had dawned, and the old Bronze Age institutions, like chariot aristocracies, were a thing of the past. A less visible but potentially devastating factor is epidemic disease. Some scholars have speculated that pandemics might have swept through late Bronze Age populations, contributing to sudden demographical and social collapse. The idea gained attention because many collapses in history, like the plague of Justinian or Black Death, had huge social impacts. In the Bronze Age case, we have hints. The Hittite archives mention a plague during the 14th century BC, brought by Egyptian prisoners that lingered for decades. Could a new wave of disease around 1200 BC have played a role? In a recent analysis, one researcher compiled 15 possible causes for the Bronze Age collapse and then added a 16th, infectious disease. He argues that the collapse's rapid timing, roughly 50 years, and the mass movements of people are reminiscent of what a deadly epidemic like smallpox or bubonic plague could cause. The diseases considered most likely by this hypothesis are bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, smallpox, or tularemia, all of which could decimate populations. Intriguingly, modern science has indeed detected traces of plague in Bronze Age contexts. DNA analysis of human remains has identified Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, in Eurasia during the Bronze Age, even as early as 2000 BC, showing that plague was present in the Old World long before its famous outbreaks in classical times. In Minoan Crete, for example, DNA from skeletons dated to around Crete's earlier Bronze Age collapse revealed plague and typhoid pathogens. This suggests that lethal diseases were around and could strike populations with no immunity. If a plague broke out in densely populated hubs or along trade routes during the late 13th century, it might have killed leaders, soldiers, farmers, weakening states from the inside and amplifying the chaos caused by famine or war. We have no direct written record of a 12th century pandemic, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially if records were lost in the turmoil. Epidemic disease, therefore, remains an intriguing possibility. It could have been a silent accomplice to the collapse, exacerbating death tolls and panic. While concrete proof is elusive, ongoing bioarchaeological research is trying to detect ancient pathogen DNA in remains from this era. If a major epidemic coincided with drought and invasion, it would indeed create an almost apocalyptic scenario for Bronze Age people, truly earning the term collapse or catastrophe often used to describe this period.
The prevailing view today is that multiple causes converged to bring about the Bronze Age collapse. None of the single factors above is sufficient on its own. Rather, they acted in combination, a sequence of blows that together overwhelmed the systemic resilience of Bronze Age civilizations. Climate stress led to famine. Famine led to internal unrest and migrations. Migrations led to warfare. Warfare disrupted trade further and undermined recovery. Perhaps disease struck populations already weakened by hunger and conflict. The interlinked nature of these problems meant feedback loops accelerated the breakdown. As one archaeological review noted, it is likely that a combination of several factors is responsible for the collapse. This multifaceted scenario has been likened to a perfect storm. No one catastrophe alone would have toppled everything, but the coincidence of many pressures did. Recent high-resolution studies confirm that around 1200 BC, there was indeed convergence of calamities, evidence of drought, signs of battle damage, abandonment of sites, all roughly overlapping in time. Thus, modern scholarship often describes the Bronze Age collapse as a complex, systemic failure, driven by both human and natural factors.
In short, the end of the Bronze Age was not a single event, but a process in which environment, economy, society, and conflict all interacted disastrously. In addition to the mainstream explanations above, a number of more speculative theories, often outside of academic consensus, have been proposed to explain the Bronze Age collapse. These range from creative to outright fantastical. A few notable ones include:
One controversial hypothesis suggests that a previously unknown civilization was behind the destruction. For example, Swiss researcher Eberhard Sänger has argued that a lost coalition of Luwian states in western Anatolia orchestrated the collapse by attacking their rivals. He ties this into an alternate interpretation of Trojan War events. Sänger even links this idea to Plato's myth of Atlantis, claiming that the Atlantis story might be a distorted memory of the Trojan War and the fall of Bronze Age cities. In his view, Troy and its allies in Anatolia became powerful enough to bring down the Mycenaeans and Hittites, and this tale survived as Atlantis in later legend. However, this theory is not widely accepted. Critics point out it relies on very sparse evidence and a lot of speculation. Mainstream archaeologists find no clear indication of an advanced, lost Luwian Empire on the scale required.
As with many mysterious historical events, the Bronze Age collapse has attracted fringe theories involving aliens or divine wrath. Ancient astronaut theorists, popularized on TV shows, have tossed around the idea that extraterrestrials either caused or tried to prevent the collapse, for instance, suggesting that alien gods who guided early civilizations might have departed around 1200 BC, leading to chaos. There is, needless to say, zero evidence for such claims, and they are not taken seriously by scholars. Similarly, some have attempted to tie the collapse to biblical events, for example, the story of the Exodus and the plagues of Egypt, or other divine punishments. But these ideas stem from religious or mythic texts rather than archaeological data. They serve more as imaginative correlations than testable hypotheses.
Another outlandish proposal is that a cosmic event, such as a comet impact, meteor airburst, or a radical change in solar activity, triggered environmental havoc leading to the collapse. Proponents of this idea point to other periods, like the collapse of the Akkadian Empire 2200 BC, or the much earlier Younger Dryas event, where cosmic impacts have been hypothesized. For the 1200 BC collapse, however, there is no known crater or definitive evidence of an impact. A variant theory speculates that a volcanic eruption, like the Hekla eruption, or a hypothetical one not yet identified, caused a nuclear winter effect. While a volcano, Hekla III, did erupt around the late 12th century, its timing and effects don't line up perfectly, and global volcano indices don't show an event massive enough to wreck all those societies simultaneously. Thus, cosmic or geological cataclysms are largely considered fringe explanations in this context. In summary, speculative theories exist but are not supported by the preponderance of evidence. The idea of an Atlantis-like lost power or extraordinary intervention makes for exciting stories. Yet archaeological research finds far more mundane causes, like those discussed earlier. The Bronze Age collapse was almost certainly a result of earthly problems, not ancient aliens or secret super-civilizations.
While outlandish hypotheses occasionally capture public imagination, the scholarly community remains focused on evidence-based factors, climate, famine, war, etc., to explain this historical puzzle. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse continues to fascinate researchers, and new discoveries in archaeology and science are steadily enhancing our understanding of what happened circa 1200 BC. In recent years, several findings have shed light on this period, sometimes confirming earlier theories and other times prompting revisions of old assumptions. One major advance has been in paleoclimate studies. The pollen analysis mentioned earlier, published by scientists including Israel Finkelstein, provided high-resolution evidence of a drought at the end of the Bronze Age, the highest resolution yet in this region, with data points every few decades. Additional climate proxies, such as oxygen isotope records from caves and sediment cores from lakes, have corroborated a shift to drier conditions around 1200 BC. These scientific methods, ranging from dendrochronology with tree rings to speleothem analysis in caves, allow researchers to reconstruct the climate that people faced. The emerging consensus is that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a significant climate stress event, lending strong support to the drought-famine component of collapse. This kind of hard data was not available to earlier historians, and it has moved the climate factor from a speculative idea to a well-founded pillar of the collapse explanation. Archaeologists have been revisiting sites associated with the collapse with fresh eyes and new techniques. Interestingly, some recent work suggests that the destruction was not as uniformly sudden or universal as once thought. For instance, researcher Jesse Millick conducted a comprehensive review of over 150 sites attributed to the 1200 BC destructions and found that many were misinterpreted. About 61% of the supposed destruction levels did not actually result from a synchronous violent event. Some sites turned out to have been destroyed at earlier or later dates. Others weren't destroyed at all, but simply abandoned or underwent cultural changes. This doesn't mean the collapse didn't happen, but it paints a more nuanced timeline. Rather than a single year of fiery apocalypse everywhere, the collapse likely played out unevenly over several decades, different in each region. Such findings encourage a more precise understanding. For example, mainland Greece's palaces might have fallen in one wave, about 1190 BC, while some Levantine cities fell a bit later, and others, like small villages, quietly declined without a fiery end. This nuanced chronology helps us chart the sequence of events, which can reveal cause and effect patterns. Example, trade cutoff leading to decline, then invaders finishing off weakened cities. The field of archaeogenetics has started contributing to Bronze Age collapse studies by analyzing DNA from ancient human remains. A landmark DNA study in 2019, mentioned earlier, traced the origins of the Philistines and found evidence of a sudden influx of southern European genetic lineage in Ashkelon around 1200 BC. This provides concrete proof of a migration, likely from the Aegean region, into the Levant at the right time, aligning with the Sea People's narrative. Ongoing DNA projects are looking at populations in Greece, Turkey, and elsewhere before and after 1200 BC to see how much genetic turnover occurred, indicative of population replacement or mixing. While results are still coming in, preliminary data suggest there were indeed significant movements of people. Such studies help confirm that the collapse was not just political, but also demographic in nature. New groups appear in the aftermath, for example, new ethnic identities and languages spread during the early Iron Age. Additionally, as mentioned, pathogen DNA screening is being applied to see if any epidemic left a genetic trace in human burials of the time. This is cutting-edge research, and if a specific plague is identified, it could be a game-changer in how we view the collapse. Another development is the focus on places that survived the collapse to learn why they did. Not every community was destroyed, and studying the survivors can reveal coping strategies. One fascinating case is a town in what is now Syria, site of Tel Twini on the coast, that appears to have weathered the end of the Bronze Age relatively intact. Recent excavations and environmental analysis at Tel Twini indicate it had access to unusual local resources. It was situated between rivers with abundant wetlands and springs nearby. This oasis of water and fertile land might have buffered the town against the regional drought conditions, allowing agriculture to continue while other areas suffered. Additionally, it may have been off the main invasion routes, sparing it from the worst of the warfare. Tel Twini's continuity suggests that environmental and geographical luck played a role in survival. Communities in well-watered or naturally protected areas could persist. By contrast, more exposed or resource-poor cities succumbed. Researchers are increasingly using this resilience perspective to understand the variability of the collapse. It shows the collapse was not monolithic. Some regions adapted and transitioned smoothly into the Iron Age, whereas others collapsed hard. Lessons from resilience studies underscore how flexibility and resource diversity might have saved some groups from the fate that others met. Scholars are also employing computer modeling and network analysis to simulate the Late Bronze Age system and its collapse. By treating the Eastern Med as a connected, complex network, some studies have tried to pinpoint weak points in the system. For example, a computational model might show that if Egypt and Mesopotamia, key grain producers, were taken out, the network connectivity of trade collapses by X%, causing a ripple effect. Early results from such models support the notion that connectivity itself bred vulnerability. The more interconnected a system, the more dramatic its collapse can be once thresholds are passed. These approaches borrow concepts from complexity science and ecology, comparing societal collapse to ecosystem collapse. While still theoretical, they help visualize the collapse not just as a series of individual events, but as a systemic chain reaction. This kind of holistic understanding is a relatively new trend in collapse studies. In summary, ongoing research, from climate science to DNA analysis to re-examined archaeology, is filling in pieces of the puzzle. Each new discovery tends to reinforce the idea that the Bronze Age collapse was multifactorial. We now have much stronger evidence for factors like drought and migration than we did decades ago, while also having a clearer timeline that nuances the old dramatic narratives. Yet, despite all this progress, there is still room for debate. Did climate change push people to become sea peoples? Or did wars cause trade routes to fail and worsen famine? The precise interplay of causes is still being debated in academic circles. The Bronze Age collapse remains a rich field of study, demonstrating how vulnerable even sophisticated civilizations can be to sudden change, a topic that resonates even today. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BC was a watershed moment in history. It abruptly ended an era of relative stability, internationalism, and high culture in the ancient world. In the aftermath, the survivors had to adapt to new realities. The grand palaces and bureaucracies were gone, but human communities endured and slowly rebuilt. Over the next few centuries, the early Iron Age, new peoples and cultures emerged from the ashes of the old. For instance, the power vacuum and mass migrations during the collapse period likely set the stage for the rise of the biblical Israelites in the Levant, and the eventual emergence of classical Greek culture in the Aegean. The Phoenician city-states that survived went on to thrive as pioneers of seaborne trade and the spread of the alphabet. In Mesopotamia, Assyria learned from the turmoil and rose to build an even larger empire in the Iron Age. In essence, the Bronze Age collapse was not the end of civilization, but a rebirth in new forms. It taught hard lessons about resilience. Societies that could not adjust to compound stresses fell, while those that innovated or had favorable geography endured. This episode is often invoked as a cautionary tale of how a complex, globalized system can implode under strain, a theme with echoes in discussions of modern societal resilience. Yet, it is also a story of renewal, after darkness, a dawn. As one historical reflection noted, it is always darkest just before the day dawneth. Indeed, out of the collapse's darkness, some of the most storied cultures in history were eventually born. The mystery of why the Bronze Age collapse happened has led us through a tapestry of factors: invaders from afar, changing climates, hungry peasants, shaking ground, new weapons, and possibly unseen microbes, all intertwined. While debates continue on the exact balance of causes, the broad understanding is that this was a complex systemic failure triggered by a confluence of events. By explaining these scholarly concepts clearly and examining the evidence, we gain insight not only into that ancient catastrophe, but also into the fragile foundations of any civilization. The Bronze Age collapse stands as a dramatic example of how human societies, no matter how advanced, remain vulnerable to shifts in their environment and interconnected world. And as ongoing research uncovers more details, we continue to learn just how multiple, subtle factors can combine to topple even the mightiest of kingdoms. In conclusion, the Bronze Age collapse was a perfect storm of calamities that ended one chapter of history and began another. Its legacy is the fascinating puzzle it left behind, a reminder that understanding the past requires piecing together clues from many disciplines. The story of this collapse, once seen as an enigmatic catastrophe, is gradually being illuminated by science and archaeology. And with each new piece of evidence, we come a step closer to comprehending how and why an entire world unraveled over 3,000 years ago, marking the tumultuous birth of the Iron Age out of the ashes of the Bronze.